Welcome to Madlik. My name is Geoffrey Stern, and at Madlik we light a spark or shed some light on a Jewish text or tradition. Along with Rabbi Adam Mintz, we host Madlik Disruptive Torah on Clubhouse every Thursday and share it as the Madlik podcast on your favorite platform. This week's parsha is Nitzavim Vayelech. One of the arguments that you hear for not supporting the current demonstrations in Israel is that they are supported or funded by foreign players, or that criticizing the government of Israel will provide fodder to our enemies. And so, we examine a deep-seated reflex of the ancient Israelites and their heirs to focus on foreign opinion and blame foreign intervention to vindicate our shortcomings. So join us for What Will the Goyim Say? Boy, the topic of today was segued right from our pre-discussion. You know, I have a one-track mind. All I can think about are the demonstrations.
Okay, so I'm looking forward to seeing how we can pull this parsha into this discussion.
Fantastic. So, you know, we have in the past talked about how we Jews kind of argue with God. The best argument we've ever had with God was Abraham at Sodom and Gomorrah, and say, what kind of a God would you be if you didn't, value 10 good people? But tonight we're going to look at, as the title says, What Will the Goyim Say, as a persistent argument that I really feel is not only throughout the Torah, but is so much throughout the Torah that it's kind of in our collective DNA. We're going to look at it, we're going to evaluate it, and we're going to try to bring it right up into the present in terms of how does it affect the very discussions that we are having today. And we talked in the pre-show, Rabbi, about this Zoom call that had happened this week under the auspices of Times of Israel, where you had 3 Anglo-American olim, people that moved to Israel, fought in the wars, joined the army, raised kids there, and they're reaching out to American Jews to participate in one way or another with the demonstrations. And the one question that comes up over and over again is, what will the Goyim say? I'm going to play a little clip from that Zoom call so that you kind of get the spirit of it and the feeling of it, and then we'll segue into the parsha. So here we go. This is Daniel Gordis on a Zoomcast with the Times of Israel reporter.
That their local federations or Jewish organizations are reluctant to take a stance for or against the judicial overhaul, any stance, perhaps out of fear of fanning the flames of anti-Semitism or BDS. And as one reader writes, I'm hoping you can explore how to navigate the line between American Jews who are afraid or at least reluctant to criticize any Israeli government lest they be seen as giving comfort to the BDS, anti-Zionist crowd, and progressive, uninvolved American Jews, which he believes is the clear majority, who see this government as confirming their harshest criticisms of Israel as a state. What are they meant to do here?
Look, I think, first of all, the notion that raising criticism of Israel is going to fuel the fires or fan the flames of anti-Semitism or BDS and so on and so forth, that's, I have to say, just silly. First of all, BDS and anti-Semitism and Jewish Voice for Peace and all of those organizations that hate Israel have never had they've never had a problem of not having enough material to talk about. Their main supply of material is Itamar Ben-Gvir. That's who their person is. When we have somebody like Ben-Gvir or Smotrich talking about how their right to drive in the West Bank should trump any right of movement of Palestinians. It doesn't matter what Daniel Gordis, Yossi Klein Halevi, or Mati Friedman say or think or do, because that's the material that the anti-Israel forces need. So the idea that we're adding fuel to this, I think, is just not true. In fact, I think quite the contrary is true. What the world is going to see is that there is an enormous part of Israeli society, and again, I mentioned this earlier, but according to the police, 7 million individual participants over the course of these weeks. Even if that number is a little high, and it strikes me that it might be a little high, it's an extraordinary number of people. That's a statement about Israel that is unbelievable, and it's unlike anything that happened in Portland and Seattle. It's anything unlike we saw in France recently, anything like we've seen in England recently. It's an extraordinary statement about the love of this population for this country, and what American Jews would be doing by criticizing the overtly racist, misogynist, corrupt, fanatical, ultra-nationalist, hyper-religious government is to say that our Jewishness is committed to a series of very serious ethical principles. And I think that silence is what feeds the anti-Semites out there and the Israel critics out there, and not speaking about it.
To segue from that into the biblical discussion, it's really when bad things happen to us, Jews, to Israel, what will the non-Jews say? And that is, I think, a reflex that I've heard over and over again. And of course, Daniel Gordist answered it in his way, where he said to the au contraire. But we should be proud of the fact that we are agonizing, that we are at an inflection point. But Rabbi, have you, in your conversations with your congregants, with your peers, come across this argument as well, or is it a lens that I'm looking through?
No, to me, this is what Jews, Zionist Jews who are committed to the state of Israel, this is the issue that they're really talking about now. Now, I think you can come out on different sides of this issue, but this is the issue that they're talking about now. I think everybody. I think that Gordis is just giving voice to this issue.
Great. Okay, so let's dive into the Parsha, dive back 2,000 years at least. In Deuteronomy 29:21, it says, "And later generations will ask, the children who succeed you and foreigners who come from distant lands, v'hanachri asher yavo me'eretz rechoka. And they will see plagues and diseases that God has inflicted upon that land." I would suggest that plagues and diseases or turmoil and infractionalism, whatever's bad happening to the Jews, and all of its soil devastated by sulfur and salt, beyond sowing and producing, no grass growing in it, just like the upheaval of Sodom and Gomorrah. So you cannot read the word Sodom and Gomorrah and think of natural disaster. You're talking about there are moral issues, there are turmoil, there is punishment. All nations will ask, why? V'amru kol hagoyim. These are the goyim. They will say, why did God do thus to this land? Wherefore that awful wrath? And they will be told, because they, the children of Israel, forsook the covenant that God of their ancestors made with them upon freeing them from the land of Egypt. They turned to the service of other gods and worshipped them, gods who they had not experienced, whom God had not allotted to them. So God was incensed at the land and brought upon it all the curses recorded in this book. So not only is there the observation that Israel is in turmoil through natural disaster, through moral turpitude, but they are being punished by their God. God uprooted them from their soil in anger, fury, and great wrath, and cast them into another land, as it is still the case. Concealed acts concern of God, but with overt acts, it is for us and our children ever to apply all the provisions of this teaching. Haniglaot lanu livanenu ad olam. So the outward signs.
That, by the way, that's the key pasuk in the whole thing. That's a very difficult pasuk. What's the distinction between that which is revealed and that which is secret? That's a weird distinction.
And normally, Rabbi, you and I would be talking about whether it's esoteric Kabbalah as opposed to Peshat. But in this context, it's talking, in my mind, between washing your laundry outside. In other words, Hanistorot la Hashem Elokeinu, that which is hidden between us is for God. Haniglaot lanu ulavanenu ad olam. But what we show to the outside world, we have to live with forever. I just, this week in reading it, I too am struck by that iconic pasuk. But in context, it all comes back to this same theme about we Jews definitely seem to have this reflex that we are more concerned than others with what others think of us.
And that's an interesting question before we go any further. Why is that true? When God wants to destroy the Jewish people after the worshiping of the golden calf, so Moshe says to God, Lama yomru Mitzrayim lemor. Why should the Egyptians say, Bira'ahotziam laharogotam beharib, that you took them out just to kill them in the mountains? So Moshe actually throws that argument back to God. Isn't that amazing?
It is. And that's, it's one thing to say we have that reflex, and then it's another thing to say, and we've taken that reflex and we've made it into a muscle. That we've taken that reflex and say, okay, so we're clearly concerned about what others think of us. So therefore we project onto God and say, God, aren't you concerned what the Egyptians are going to think? Here you took us out of Egypt to free a people, and now you've destroyed them. You've killed them because they had a golden calf. We've really projected this. And we will, what I'm going to do is do a little survey of not only the verses in the Torah, but some of those verses are going to ring very true this time of year, because you'll see they come from our high holiday services themselves. So I agree with you totally, Rabbi. This is something that the Jews have really crafted. They've made it an art form.
That's a funny way to look at it, but you're 100% right.
So as you quoted in Deuteronomy, it rehashes the golden calf, and Moses' argument, besides the obvious, which is what about the covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, in Deuteronomy 9:28, he goes, else the country from which you freed us will say it was because God was powerless to bring them into the land promised to them. So it's like turning it on God. It says, you can't afford to punish us. The whole world is watching. You've made a test case of this project. And if we fail, you fail. And because of having rejected them, their God brought them into the wilderness to kill them. So it's almost like not only will you be accused of being a powerless God, you will be accused of being a revengeful God. I mean, it's almost, and I've talked about this before, the way a child talks to their parents and is able to turn things around. So it's not their fault; it's their parents' fault. But here we're focused on the munitions of these arguments and why, how these arguments came about and how sustained they are. Because I think to be able to answer the question raised to Daniel Gordis, we have to know how deep the reflex is. In Kings 9:8, it says, and for this house one so exalted, everyone passing by it shall be appalled and shall hiss. So you're passing by the destroyed temple, anything that is destroyed of the Jewish people, and you hiss. That is more important to me than what follows. That you are concerned as as much about what others will say as they're passing by as the destruction of the temple or whatever the edifice is itself. And when they ask, why did God do thus to the land and to this house? They shall be told it is because they forsook the eternal. So there, you really have to parse this. I'm focused more on the argument and the justification and the strategic move, and less on the answer. The answer is all very similar. The Jews did not keep God's laws, so they're being punished. But the question is not what you'd expect, which is introspective and wondering, how did this happen to me? It goes that extra mile and says, others will ask you, how did this happen to you?
Yeah, let me hear what you have to say.
Good. So, and again, we have an example of that in Jeremiah 16. It says, and when you announce all these things to that people, and they ask, why has God decreed upon us this fearful evil? What is the iniquity? What is the sin? And it answers, because God deserted me, declares God. So we do have examples of what you would expect. But bringing in the other, the non-Jew, I think is intrinsically, remarkably a Jewish reflex. So, as usual, I went to thetorah.com. I've been doing
Here you go.
There's an article there that says, when God punishes Israel, what will the Gentiles say? And this Professor Rabbi Marty Lakshin says, it makes much more sense for a polytheist to believe that when Israel suffers misfortune, it is because Israel's God is not sufficiently powerful or has rejected them, rather than believing that Israel had sinned, citing such details as the covenant God made with Israel at the Exodus. In other words, it's very clear that this is something that we Jews are projecting. Because if you're a polytheist and Zeus is your god and Baal is the other guy's god, and you win the war, you don't say it's because the other guys were not faithful to Baal. It's because Zeus is stronger, more powerful. It's clear that this comes from the psyche of the Jewish people, which leads this guy to write a whole article on, number one, documenting, cataloging these instances, but also questioning why. And I think that's really the subject of tonight. He quotes a major Jewish academic, Moshe Weinfeld, who gives verse after verse, and I'll give you a little bit of a survey. In Numbers 14, it says, if then you slay this people, ki'ish echad, like a single participant, the nations who have heard your fame will say, it must be because God was powerless. So here it's interesting, the Hebrew that it talks about, that's translated, that the nations have heard your fame will say, hagoyim asher shamu et shemacha. This is all about God's name. You know, we say a name is your honor. It's all about the honor. And here it really, so much of the high holiday services are raising up the name of God, and sin, ultimately, in the Jewish lexicon, it's a chilul Hashem. It's a desecration.
So we haven't brought that up. That's an interesting term that we haven't talked about it. Right? How does Lama Yomru Mitzrayim? What will the Egyptians say? Is that a chilul Hashem?
Well, I hadn't even thought of talking about it until I read that pasuk and you confirmed it. But yes, this is the chilul Hashem, is the bumper sticker for what will the goyim say. That's the two-word thing. Is it's not bad enough that you did wrong, but you are desecrating God's name in public. You're taking the whole project, and in public you're saying, we ran out of funds, we're busted. It's kind of unique. You know, there are things about Judaism. Monotheism is unique. Our sense of tzedek is unique. But this reflex is definitely unique, and it goes in our DNA, and it, I would almost say, transcends religion. we Jews have this reflex. What will the others say? And it's fascinating. I don't have an answer for you, Rabbi. I don't know if you have an answer, but I do believe.
No, I don't. But I think raising the question is itself, important, right?
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. And again, it does tie into the high holidays, because ultimately, at the end of the day, for the high holidays, we are talking about a day where l'taken sumo.
Right. So let me l'taken olam malchut shaddai. But I want to tell you something else even better than that, and that is that the pasuk that you quoted, "Hanistarot Lashem Elokeinu v'aniglot lanu levanenu," that is a verse that's used in the Yom Kippur liturgy. It's not in the Rosh Hashanah liturgy, but it is in the Yom Kippur liturgy. Right? So I'm saying, so you say it's related to Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. It's actually related to Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur.
And the verses that Weinfeld brings to compound his case, I'm going to read a few. You'll see how they really tie into what we do on Rosh Hashanah. In Psalms 25:11, it says, "As befits your name, O Lord, pardon my iniquity, 3 it be great. Leman shemecha Hashem v'salachta la'avoni ki rav hu." I mean, it's in for the idea of doing it for God's name. You have to add the name that he is known. You have to add that the name that he is recognized among the nations. You can't, the idea of this Chilul Hashem, of his name, is tied into what will they say. It says in Tehillim 109, "Now you, O God, my Lord, act on my behalf as befits your name, good and faithful as you are, save me. V'ato Hashem Adoshem asa iti leman shmecho ki tov chastecha hatzileni." This all comes directly out of, if you look at the Machzor and you talk about the Avinu Malkeinu, it says, "Do it for your name's sake. O King, for your sake, if not for ours, lemancha im lemanenu." And what I'm trying to do is do what Weinfeld is doing, which is tie that into this argument that you so touched upon before, which is to take this reflex and say to God, "You can't kill me because everybody is watching. You took me out of Egypt. You gave us the Torah. You promised us a land. If you do that, it is going to desecrate your name." And it's so it's really written into almost the threadwork of our religion, and it comes out so clearly here in the verses that we talk about, where it literally talks about forever, ad olam, for your children, but it literally says, what will the Nachri, what will the goyim say? And again, it doesn't have to be that way. I quoted the Jeremiah, but you could be logical about it. And there is the negative side, the flip side of the coin, which is we forget about our own sake and we focus only on the perception outside. And I guess that's where we're going now, which is, when does this become a distraction? When does this become something that deflects the real work and the introspection on Yom Kippur, but also fixing the country that we all have to do?
Yeah, that's also a good question, what the line is. And, now if you want to go back to Gordis, so you say, and what they're saying is that the line in this situation is different than the line usually is, right? Right, I'm saying that also, they're changing. I think the term they use is they're changing the goalposts. Right, they're saying that usually the goalposts are here. American Jews don't criticize Israel, but in this case we have to do it. And what will the goyim say? Well, we need to be concerned about that. And what will the Jews say? And we need to be identified with the people who have spent 35 Saturday nights on Kaplan.
So what I want to do is I want to enlarge Gordis's argument. Gordis argues that now is a time that transcends this reflex. He also made an argument, and I suggest to all of you, and I'll put it in the notes on Sefaria, a link to the Zoom call that he made. He also says that, we can chew gum and walk at the same time, that we can be for Israel, for protection of Israel on the one hand, and we can also be critical of Israel because we're part of Israel. But what I would like to do is, those of you who listen to Madlik know that I'm a big fan of Zionism, and I'm a big fan of the concept that once we got our own land, the laws change, whether you call it a new Jew or new rules or whatever. And what I would argue, and maybe I'll play it and maybe I won't, I have another recording of an interaction with someone called Rav Stav from Tzohar. And she asked the same question in his public speech, and she went even farther. She said, I told my friend in Israel, when you're demonstrating, do you know that you are propping up BDS, that you are giving fodder to the anti-Semites? And her friend, the demonstrator, says, I don't care. I only care about my country. And what I would like to pursue now is the possibility, based on a Rashbam, on our texts here, that things change when you're in Israel. So there is a Rashbam on Deuteronomy 9:25 that is quoted in that article in thetorah.com that actually parses this argument. And it says, when Moses argued with God that if you kill the Jews in the desert after the sin of the golden calf, the Egyptians will say, you brought them out of Egypt to kill them here. You're a weak God. He says that argument ends when the Jews get to Israel. That argument ends when God fulfills his promise. He says, just as his prayers had been helpful when they were in the desert, similar prayers would be equally helpful once the people were in the Holy Land. That was the supposition. And Moses is saying, no, not so. That doesn't happen that way. This Rashbam is in the source notes, and you can read it in its entirety. But his argument is literally for a new Jew. Once you are in Israel, that argument no longer exists, and you are on your own. You've been given the country. It is your country. It is sink or swim. It is your project. And you either have to make it work or it won't. But don't look outside, either from the perspective of, why should I be listening to the non-Jews who tell me how to be moral? No, don't outsource your morality. Don't outsource and say that the people that are fighting against me are supported. This Rabbi Stav says, when the woman says to her, do you think outsiders are funding these demonstrations? He goes, you can't fund 200,000 Tel Avivians to come out 36 weeks in a row. This is organic. This is internal. And I think part of the evolution that we need to all go through is following on what the Rashbam is saying, is that there are different rules. There is an understanding, Rabbi, you can argue that Deuteronomy was written when the Jews were coming back from Babylon, or it was written with a vision of what it would be like to coming back from Babylon. There was in the verses that I quoted today something about even till this day. But the point is that there is a lot of what we have reviewed today where it talks about what will they say that has a sense of a galut mentality. You asked, why would we think that way? A minority thinks in a certain way. A minority has to be particularly sensitive to what others think. And I think this moment is a moment where we realize what it is to have our own land. And having our own land means that we have to fight for what is right, come what may, and that we can't look over our shoulder. I found this Rashbam to be so powerful in terms of, what in the yeshiva we would call two laws. One is when you're outside of Israel, and one is when you are in Israel. It's a powerful Rashbam, but I think there's something there. But I do believe that we have to confront the overwhelming nature of this argument and decide whether it's with us or we evolve beyond it. It's a fascinating question to ask and to ponder.
I think that's really good. And it's interesting to end on that note. I mean, I think if we just, you started with Gordis's podcast and, the idea of what will the goyim say. And then what we did was we did an interesting thing tonight. And that is we took it backwards. We took it back to the Chumash, but we saw in the Chumash exactly the same kind of consideration. Lama Yomru Mitzrayim. And we saw it in Yirmiyahu, and we saw it in Tehillim. And so you see that some things, the more they change, the more they stay the same. And I think this is an example of that, and that's great.
I think there's studies that have been done that even the most secular Jew, for instance, really has inclination for tzedakah. There's issues with donating organs because people who don't ever go to synagogue say, we Jews don't do that. I do feel that this is something that's in our texts that really has moved itself into our DNA. And sometimes the ideas that are in our reflex are not so much good. And I think this is one that we need to address. But it is, as you say, fascinating to look at it 2,000 years ago in the text. And I thank, as always, the privilege of doing it with you, Rabbi. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom, everybody, and we'll see you next week. Take care.
You got it. Hey, Lauren, how you doing?
We as Jews have a unique ability to recognize an opportunity to better ourselves. We left Egypt. It was not an easy decision. We wandered through Sinai for 40 years, trying through 4 different generations or 2 different generations. Isn't that who we are as a people? Is it relevant what the goyim think of us? Is it relevant to have us segregated in a static environment, such as many of the Orthodox Jews are propounding us to become, to stay with what we are? I think this conversation is it's relevant for us to identify who we are as a people and who we have and how we've become a nation, and why do we want to go backwards, and why are we concerned about what the goyim think of us? Is there any?
I am in total agreement with you, and I think, but part of it is, recognizing the texts, recognizing the liturgy, recognize this reflex reaction that we have, and also recognizing, and I quoted Jeremiah, but clearly there is an alternative thread. And that thread, I think, we've given to the world. This thread that you reference, which is moral integrity, holding ourselves to a higher standard. All of the things that you mentioned, being the underdog, and therefore for having a communal memory where we remember that we were slaves, that we were the underdogs, honoring others. Nothing that I said tonight was meant to belittle that, to undermine that. It's, if anything, it is to celebrate all that. But I do think that there are multiple threads that go through our texts and our traditions. And the thread that I was looking at tonight has not gone away. It's there. So I think it needs to be called out, to use the modern lingo. It has to be recognized. And as you just said, why do we care? We have so much to be proud of that we shouldn't have to outsource our morality or outsource any of this stuff. And, in the article from thetorah.com, it talks about some of the scholars that might have been influenced by Christianity, which ultimately used the fact that the Jews were a minority persecuted people as a proof that God had rejected them. And this scholar argues in his article that obviously the proof was not that God had rejected them and replaced them. The proof was that God had rejected them and wanted them back. But they totally bought into the fact that there was a proof here, and it was a public proof, that God simply didn't want to punish them, but punish them in a public manner. And I think that all goes into all of the different variables of being the negative side of being that minority, the negative side of being the person who was a stranger. The positive side is you get to honor the other stranger. The negative side is you carry all of this baggage. And I think this issue of what will they say is part of the baggage part, and it served a purpose, but it needs to be recognized for what it is, and we need to evolve beyond it. And I love the fact that a medieval scholar named Rashbam, who was certainly not thinking about a modern state of Israel, just kind of stumbled upon the fact that things can change when you're in your homeland. And what the modern Zionists would call a new Jew. We have a chance to reboot ourselves. And I think that when it comes to the current events and the discussions that we're having, what the role of foreign Jews are is one that should not be decided based on what others would say. That was the point that I was trying to make. We need to find what side of right we're on, and if we believe that the demonstrators are doing the right thing, we need to show solidarity with them and support them, and not look over our shoulder. And but it's amazing how these ancient texts can talk to us today, I think.
I agree with your conclusion. Shabbat Shalom was a wonderful
Shabbat
teaching.
Shalom. See you all next week.